The dismissal order arrived while Adeyemi was elbow-deep in a Vakharan memory weave, and she bled on it. Not much a paper cut from the courier drone's delivery flap, the kind that takes a moment to register. She felt the sting, looked at her left index finger, and then looked at the weave spread across the conservation table. 900 years of diplomatic negotiation encoded in filaments of treated silk and compressed mineral dye, the colors still vivid enough to make her chest ache. The weave was losing tension in the third quadrant. Another 6 hours without intervention, and the eastern border agreements would start to delaminate. She pressed her finger to her hip to stop the bleeding and kept working. The order sat on the edge of the table. She could read the header from here. Imperial Bureau of Diplomatic Affairs. Termination of service and the date stamp. And her own name in the bureaucratic font she'd learned to associate with her entire adult life. She had been 14 years old when she first saw that font on her officer's commission. She was 53 now. She kept working. Siveth had been observing from the doorway for 11 minutes by the time Adeyemi set down her tools and picked up the order. Siveth's record of time was involuntary. The Vekaran nervous system tracked intervals the way a human heartbeat tracked rhythm, steady and without effort. She had come to collect the general for the afternoon briefing and found her, instead, doing this. Whatever this was. Adeyemi read the order twice. She folded it in thirds and tucked it into the breast pocket of her conservation apron. Then she checked the humidity readings on the table's embedded panel, made 2 small adjustments with a microtensioner, and stepped back to look at her work. General Adeyemi, Siziveth said. Her translator rendered her clicks and resonance tones into standard, as always. But the hesitation between words was her own. The briefing. I won't be attending future briefings. Adeyemi picked up a second tool and bent back over the weave. And it's just Adeyemi now. The general part's been rescinded. Siveth processed this. Her antennae. The short, sensing pair. Not the longer communication ones moved in the small, unconscious pattern that meant she was doing that processing. The Empire has removed your commission? The Empire has removed my commission. Why? Adeyemi's hands did not stop moving. Budget review. Restructuring. The new administration doesn't see value in a dedicated cultural liaison when they can route everything through Consul Bren. A pause. The microtensioner made a sound like a whispered argument. He's 29. He's never been off station before last month. Siveth looked at the dismissal orders rectangle in Adeyemi's pocket. Then she looked at the weave. Then she looked at Adeyemi's hands, which were doing something precise and patient with a damaged section near the center, where the treaty's original language lived in the oldest layer of silk. You did not stop working, Siziveth said. It would have dried. Adeyemi didn't look up. The delamination process accelerates past a certain point. If I'd stopped to read the paperwork, the whole third quadrant would have gone. 900 years of border negotiation. Gone because I had feelings about my employment status. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. That seemed like a bad trade. Siveth remained in the doorway for another moment. Her communication antennae shifted a private frequency, not the one connected to her translator. A check-in with her hivekin on the residential level, maybe. A request for someone else's perspective on what she'd just witnessed. Then she folded herself into the low chair Adeyemi kept for visitors and waited. She didn't know, yet, what she was waiting for. Consul Bren arrived with a retinue and a folder of proposed amendments, and the particular energy of someone who had prepared very thoroughly for the wrong meeting. Adeyemi heard him from 2 volts away. Her hearing had always been good, a survival skill from decades in military command, where you learned to pass sound the way some people passed text. The Vekharan archive was a quiet place, built for quiet by people whose communication happened partly at frequencies humans couldn't make, and so Bren's voice carried even when he was trying to be professional. Understand the ceremonial significance, of course, but the clause as written creates a regulatory burden that... She set down her tools and walked to the vault's edge. The Vekharan council chamber was adjacent to the archive wing, separated by a membrane door that the Vekharans kept partially permeable so the archivists could feel the atmospheric shift when formal proceedings began a courtesy, like an open window. Adeyemi had spent years learning to read that atmospheric shift the way other people read body language. Right now, it was telling her that the 7 council members seated across from Consul Bren had gone into what she thought of as the withdrawal pattern, their outer limbs drawn in, their resonance frequencies dropping below conversation range, their communication antennae angled slightly backward. It was the Vekharan equivalent of folding your arms and staring at the ceiling. Bren was talking about grain shipment regulations. The clause he wanted to amend was, in the original treaty language, the clause of first harvest, a ceremonial designation that predated the trade agreement by 200 years that connected the physical act of commerce to a Vekharan religious observance about scarcity and abundance and what it meant to give something away. It wasn't a regulatory burden. It was, in every way that mattered, a promise. He didn't know that. He had the clause number and the economic modeling and the folder, but he didn't have the 900 years. Adeyemi watched one of the council members, the eldest, Kethav, begin the slow process of standing. In Vekharan formal protocol, a standing elder meant the proceedings were over. It meant, we will not continue this conversation. It meant something much worse than anger. She walked through the membrane door. The resonance in the room hit her like stepping into a different weather. Sivith was here too, positioned near the wall in her aide's capacity, and Adeyemi saw her antennae go straight up. I apologize for the interruption, Adeyemi said, in standard, because her Vekharan was good but not council chamber good. She positioned herself not between Bren and the council that would be a challenge, but slightly to the side, where a translator would stand. Consul Bren, there's a conservation emergency in Vault 7. I need a decision about resource allocation before the end of the hour. It was not true. But Bren didn't know that either. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been interrupted mid-sentence and wasn't sure by what authority. Adeyemi, this is an active. The Vault 7 issue involves the original treaty artifacts, your jurisdiction as senior imperial representative. She kept her voice neutral and her eyes on him. It's time-sensitive. A long moment. The atmospheric resonance in the room shifted slightly. She felt it more than heard it. A millimeter of pressure change. Someone was listening very carefully. Bren straightened his folder. We'll continue this later, he told the council, and followed her out. She let him get his questions out in the corridor. What emergency? Why didn't she calms him? Who authorized her to interrupt? She answered each one with something polite and technically accurate, and entirely beside the point. Then she sent him to Vault 3 on a documentation errand that would take 40 minutes. When she came back through the membrane door, the council was still assembled. Kethav was seated again. Adeyemi stood in the entrance and said, in Vekharan, halting, imperfect, the accent of someone who had learned the language as an adult. The phrase from the treaty's original signing ceremony, the one that meant, I acknowledge what has been given. I acknowledge what it cost. The resonance in the room changed completely. It took her a moment to identify what it had changed into. It was, she thought, something like relief. She bowed in the Vekharan manner from the midsection, arms loose, and went back to the archive. Sivith caught up with her at the vault entrance. That phrase, she said, Where did you? I read a lot. Adeyemi pulled on her conservation gloves. The original signing transcripts are in Vault 9. They're in the secondary archive, which means Bren doesn't have access clearance yet. Siveth's antennae moved. How long have you known that phrase? About 6 years. I've been waiting for a reason to use it. She looked down at the weave. The third quadrant's holding. I think we got it. Siveth looked at the weave, too. At the colors, the encoded history, the 900 years of careful negotiation preserved in silk. You carry it, Siveth said. Not quite a question. Someone has to. The thermal seal failed at 0340 ship time, which was the hour when the archive felt most like the interior of a held breath. Adeyemi had been sleeping in the small room adjacent to the conservation lab, one of the archive's residential cells, technically for visiting scholars, which she had been occupying for 3 weeks without anyone officially acknowledging it. She woke to the alarm and was in the vault before the emergency lighting finished cycling. The seal had cracked along a stress fracture in the outer hull-facing wall. Condensation was coming and not water exactly, but the conclave station's atmospheric moisture, which ran higher than the archive's controlled environment by about 30%. Enough to ruin everything in Vault 4 within hours. Vault 4 held the original Accords. She was already pulling artifacts when Siveth arrived, moving with the quick, precise efficiency that Adeyemi had spent 3 years learning to read as urgency. 2 other Vekaran archivists came after her. They formed a line without being asked. Adeyemi passing items back, Siveth relaying them, the others stacking in the dry corridor. And nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes, because there wasn't anything to say, and there wasn't any time. Siveth's manipulator limbs were faster than human hands, 6 of them, each independently articulate, able to brace and grip and transport 3 items at once. Adeyemi watched her move through her peripheral vision and felt the particular humility of understanding that she was, in this specific physical task, the slower partner. But the original Accord was different. It was the oldest thing in the vault, older than the modern treaty, older than the Empire's involvement. A preliminary agreement between the first Vekaran delegation and the first human explorers who had stumbled into this system and not shot at anything which had apparently been remarkable enough to warrant documentation. The silk was ancient. It needed to be moved in a specific orientation, at a specific angle, with specific pressure distribution across the width. Siveth reached for it. Wait, Adeyemi said. She came around the table and positioned her hands under the weave. Both hands, palms up, wrists, angled the way she'd learned from 9 years of working with Vekaran conservators. She lifted it in one movement and carried it to the corridor herself. Then she came back and looked at the seal. The fracture was irregular, maybe 15 centimeters, the condensation already beating on the wall surface. The station's repair systems would get here eventually, but eventually was not the time frame that mattered. She looked at what she had, her conservation kit, a water reclaimer from the emergency supply cabinet standard station equipment, designed to pull moisture from air and store it. A heating coil she'd been using for controlled drying in the main lab, 40 centimeters of thermal bonding tape from her kit's edge sealant supply. Siveth appeared at her shoulder. The repair team has been notified. Estimated response time is 2 hours. 1 hour, 40 minutes. Too long. Adeyemi was already pulling the water reclaimer's intake housing loose. Help me with this. Siveth watched her work for a moment. What are you building? I don't know yet. She pulled the heating coil free from its casing and held it next to the reclaimer. The coil generated a dry heat. The reclaimer pulled moisture. Together, oriented correctly. Yes. If I run the coil's output into the reclaimer's intake, it'll pull the condensation before it reaches the artifacts. It won't hold forever, but it'll hold long enough. That is not what either of those components is designed to do. No. She was already cutting the bonding tape into strips. It took her 40 minutes. The device looked like something a resourceful child would make from spare parts, which was essentially what it was. She mounted it against the fracture with the tape and the conservation clamps, and one of her gloves folded into a wedge shape, and when she turned it on, it hummed wrong frequency, slightly labored, and the condensation on the wall began, slowly, to recede. She sat down on the vault floor with her back against the empty shelving unit and looked at the original Accord, which Scifi had propped carefully against the far wall during the repair. It held, she said. Scifi was looking at the improvised device. Her antennae moved through several configurations Adeyemi didn't have words for. Then she crossed the vault and sat down beside Adeyemi on the floor, an unusual posture for a veteran, a deliberately lowered position, and looked at the Accord with her. 4 hours of micro-repair, Scifi said. After this, the condensation got into the border layer. Adeyemi flexed her hands. It's fine. I've done worse. Scifi was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Adeyemi thought about it. Outside the vault, she could hear the station's normal sounds, the hum of systems, the distant click of Vacheron communication in frequencies her ears could detect but not decode. Because it matters, she said. Because someone sat down 900 years ago with a person who was completely unlike them and said, "We can figure this out." And they did. And that shouldn't just dissolve because a thermal seal cracked. She got up and reached for her micro-tools. Scifi remained on the floor for a while after that, very still, in the way Adeyemi had learned meant she was in deep resonance with her hivekin, sharing something, working something out. The withdrawal notice arrived at 0900 on a Tuesday, formatted on imperial letterhead with the same bureaucratic font that had shaped the entire geography of Adeyemi's life. Bren read it aloud in the council chamber, which was either protocol or a miscalculation of the room. The Vacheron council members were present. The resonance shifted the moment he got to the third paragraph, the part about restructuring diplomatic priorities, and Adeyemi felt it in her back teeth, a subsonic pressure that wasn't quite sound, the Vacheron equivalent of a collective intake of breath. She was standing against the wall, no longer an official anything, present only because Scifi had mentioned the meeting time within her earshot, and she had interpreted that as an invitation. Bren finished reading. He set the letter down. He seemed to understand, too late, that he had done something wrong in the reading of it, though she suspected he couldn't have said what. Kethav spoke. Scifi translated, her voice careful. The council asks what representation will remain. The Empire is restructuring its. What person will remain? Bren paused. The diplomatic corps will maintain communication through. What person? Adeyemi watched him. He was not a bad man. He was young and undertrained, and nobody had told him the right things. And there was a version of this that wasn't his fault. But there was also a council full of beings whose emotional states she could feel in her skeleton, and they were asking about continuity, about presence, about the specific human quality of staying, and he didn't have the framework to understand what was being asked. There will be official channels, he said. The resonance dropped. It didn't escalate, it dropped, which was worse. Kethav's outer limbs began the slow drawing in. Adeyemi said, quietly, to Scifi, if a civilian applies for residential archive status, long-term scholarly residency, does the council have jurisdiction to approve it independently of the Imperial Diplomatic Corps? Scifi turned to look at her. Her communication antennae shifted. Yes, she said. It's a separate administrative track, Cultural and scholarly residency has never been under imperial authority. How long would the application take? A pause. I could file it now. It would be processed within the hour. Adeyemi looked at the council, at Kethov, whose limbs had stilled, at the resonance in the room, which was not yet lost. Then file it, she said. Siziveth's antennae moved in a quick, private pattern. Then she stepped to the small workstation at the chamber's edge and began to type. The application took 11 minutes. Adeyemi stood against the wall and watched Bren try to find the right thing to say and not find it. And she thought about the original accord in Vault 4 and the way the colors were still vivid after 9 centuries, and what it meant to decide every day that something was worth preserving. Siveth looked up from the workstation. Approved, she said. Kethov's limbs relaxed, very slightly. Adeyemi let out a breath. 6 months later, she knew where the kitchen kept the saw root. This was a significant development. The residential kitchen on level 4 was a communal space shared by 12 Vekaran archivists and 2 visiting scholars from a species that communicated through bioluminescent skin patches, and the organizational logic of its shelving system had taken her 4 months to parse. Saarut was kept in the 3rd cabinet from the left at a height of approximately 1.2 meters, which was below Vekaran reach and above the bioluminescent scholar's comfortable range, and which was therefore a shelf nobody used. And she had claimed it by quiet occupation the way she'd been claiming spaces her entire life. She ground the root with the small stone tool Siziveth had provided without comment 6 weeks ago. The resulting powder went into water heated to just below boiling, and then she waited, and then she had something that was approximately Sa, a Vekaran communal drink, bitter and mineral, served at every formal occasion and most informal ones. Her approximation was probably wrong in 11 specific ways, but she had been working on it. She brought 2 cups to the archive. The council vote had happened this morning. She had not been in the chamber, she had been in Vault 9, cross-referencing a discrepancy in the secondary archives indexing system, because there was always something to do in Vault 9, and she had learned to trust that staying busy was its own form of presence. Siveth had sent her a status update at 0800 in session, another at 0930 deliberating. Nothing after that. She was measuring a section of newly acquired diplomatic textile when the vault door opened. Siziveth moved differently than she had 6 months ago. Or maybe Adeyemi had simply learned to read her better, the angle of her communication antennae, the way she held her outer limbs when she was carrying something she considered important. She came across the vault and stopped at the table's edge. The council voted to maintain the treaty, Siziveth said, independently of the Empire's withdrawal. The Vekaran Conclave will honor all existing terms and extend formal recognition to any future human diplomatic presence, imperial or otherwise. Adeyemi held the textile she'd been measuring and said nothing for a moment. On what basis? She asked. Siveth's antennae shifted. Kethov argued that the treaty exists between peoples, not governments. That it was made by people who stayed in the same room long enough to understand each other, and that its validity depends on that quality of relationship rather than on which administrative body currently claims authority. A pause. The council agreed. Adeyemi set the textile down carefully. "There's something I want to ask you," Siziveth said. "My hivekin have been asking me, for 6 months, what humans are. I have been telling them what I observe, but observation is not. There is a Vekaran word. I don't think Standard has it. The thing that happens when you understand something from the inside, not just the outside." "Understanding," Adeyemi said. "Or maybe feeling." "Perhaps." Sisyphus looked at the vault, the shelves, the indexed materials, the careful order of 900 years. I think I am beginning to have that word for humans. Adeyemi looked at her, and then down at the 2 cups she'd been carrying. I made sa, she said. It's probably wrong. Sivith looked at the cups. Her antennae moved in the small pattern that Adeyemi had learned, over 6 months of proximity, to read as the Veccaran equivalent of a suppressed smile. The temperature should be closer to boiling, and the grind is too coarse. I know, I've been working on it. Sivith took the cup from her hands. It was a gesture requiring 3 of her manipulator limbs. She held it the way Adeyemi had seen Veccaran elders hold ritual vessels, not with reverence, exactly, but with a kind of considered attention, the recognition that some objects carry more than their physical weight. She drank. Outside the vault's small viewport, the gas giant that the conclave orbited was turning through its own slow business. Bands of amber and rust catching the light of a star that had been burning for 5 billion years before either of their species had looked up at it. The station hummed. The archive was quiet. Somewhere on level 4, one of the bioluminescent scholars was probably puzzling over a shelf they couldn't quite reach. Sivith lowered the cup. Her antennae moved through something long and private. It tastes wrong, she said. I know. I will show you the correct grind. Adeyemi picked up her own cup and drank. The sa was bitter and mineral, and nothing like what Sisyphus hivekin probably made at home, and she found that she didn't mind at all. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Sisyphus agreed. The gas giant kept turning. The station kept humming. Adeyemi set her cup down and reached for the textile she'd been measuring, and Sivith pulled up the indexing catalog, and they worked together in the archive's particular quiet, while the light outside shifted slowly, through amber, through rust, through the long colors of a world that had been here before them and would be here long after.